I am super happy and excited to be here with you guys. As was shared earlier, we had a conversation about a year and a half earlier, but a lot has changed, and we are super excited to talk about what we've been doing in the past year and a half since the last presentation. One of the kind of founding principles of the company was the idea of delivering the public cloud experience on premises. And we have a saying inside the company. We say the public cloud is really a model, not so much a destination and a physical place. So the question is, how do you actually go about and deliver this to the enterprises? So that was the founding vision of the company, is like, how do we actually have the on-premises CIOs that have a lot of responsibilities be able to match what the expectations of their users are within the enterprise, because they go and use AWS and they come back and why can't I have the same experience inside the company, right? So a little bit about the company itself. It's founded by folks that had worked at 3PAR as founders and engineers, and a lot of early and the CEO of the company is the CEO of 3PAR is our executive chairman. We were founded in November of 2018. We have offices both in US, primarily in Silicon Valley and Seattle, and we also have offices in UK, specifically London and Belfast. We have a number of about 25 patents. Says 23, but we actually have 25 patents filed. And we are super excited because we have folks also on the cloud piece, and we'll get to why the cloud matters from a management perspective in our environment. So one of the things that we kind of wanted to understand was we posited the fact that the customers want this experience of the cloud on premises. So we actually had the ESG research go and do a survey for us, and the results were quite interesting. About 50% of enterprise CIOs have in fact repatriated some workload back onto their environments, and the reason is around the cost savings. And in fact, when they do repatriate, they actually want that experience back on the premise. So they repatriate it due to cost savings, but at the end of the day, they still would like to match as much of the experience as possible. And in fact, IDC has done some interesting research, and in their wording, there is this DCIaaS, or data center infrastructure as a service. It's kind of essentially a market that is developing from a mere 140 million in 2021 going to north of 14 billion in 2025. I mean, that's exponential growth. Another piece that is quite interesting is this. I don't know if you have seen it. There's an Anderson Horowitz paper that came out not too long ago. It's called "The Cost of the Cloud: a $1 trillion Paradox." And what they observed was a lot of the money that they're actually spending on their companies that are funding is going into the pockets of hyperscale cloud providers, and they feel about $1 trillion the value of their VCs is disappearing into that space. So the question, then the primary driver is the cost. So this is a real problem for companies, and they have to deal with this. So and this cloud experience is really needed both at the edge and the core. Telecom 5G rollout is a great place for a lot of the edge locations to actually be able to take this technology. There's a lot going on in the healthcare space, and the fact that people can't get to the clinics to deal with the IT infrastructure, and this is just all has to be managed like the cloud. There are places that you just can't take the workload to the cloud: manufacturing, financial services, and a lot of kind of boutique cloud service providers. So what do we do about that? So enterprises really have to adopt the cloud model. That's the only way for them to be able to gain the efficiencies they need to be able to compete. So in order to understand what it is to adopt a cloud model, we have to understand the architecture of the cloud itself. How does cloud actually implement it? And what better model to look at than AWS, which is arguably the leader in this space. So when we think about how do they architect their system, right? They have three pillars that makes up this cloud operating platform. The first one of which is AWS Management Console. This is kind of their cloud management brain. It's accessed either through UI or API, and its job is primarily to sort of provide global automation, kind of non-disruptive operations in the background, and really just makes the infrastructure go away. That's what the management console is all about. But in order to kind of make this all work, they have invented this thing called a Nitro card that sits in every server. So they have industry standard servers all over the place in their data centers, but they have added this Nitro card. There's actually a couple of flavors, one that does networking, one that does the storage, and they offload all the enterprise data services onto this card. It creates a level of isolation and fault domain security, isolation in terms of the security and also fault domain isolation, and allows the entire system to actually work much more efficiently, because a lot of the workload is moved onto the card as opposed to running on the Intel CPUs. The last but not least part of the environment is the idea of what they call Amazon machine images. So when you're trying to kind of deploy workloads, there's a set of predefined images that you could sort of instantiate. What that really does for the customer is the idea of being able to get the exact same consistent deployment every time. The maintenance is consistent, and they have a variety of the various machine images that are there. So you can actually kind of deploy a small machine, a large machine, one that does web services, one that does SQL services. So it's almost like a menu of some sort. You kind of pick what you want, and it gets deployed every time the same way. So what have we done? What we've done, we essentially have built what we call the Nebulon on console. It's our version of cloud management. And the idea is to sort of make the infrastructure all be able to get managed from the cloud behind an API. And it's amenable to using it with Ansible or any kind of deployment tool that you wish to use. What we've added to this is the idea of zero trust SaaS delivery model. The enterprises have a very different set of security requirements, especially if you have physical infrastructure on premises. So we've kind of had to rethink the security such that it works well for the enterprises. The second pillar was, we talked about the AWS Nitro. In our case, it's our Nebulon SPU and the operating system that runs on the card itself. It does the offloaded data services. It does kind of the high-end enterprise storage services that one would expect, but it also kind of provides an isolated file domain for management and for the IO path. But we've done one better. In the case of AWS, they have a homogeneous environment. They have their own servers that they've spec'd out, and it gets built for them. But a typical enterprise, doesn't really have that choice. They can't really kind of create their own server. They have to buy it from the existing server vendors. So in our model, the card itself, the Nebulon SPU, gets shipped with it works with this, your choice of supply vendors. Server vendors could be, Dell, HP, Lenovo, whomever is your favorite server vendor. You buy your server with, but you just include our card, and you get the Nebulon on platform. And we talked about the machine images. We also have our own version of machine images, but we've actually taken care to include an additional set of services we call immutability. So in the case of AWS, they have immutability on day one. So when you create your instantiate your image, you get the exact same thing over and over again, because the instantiation comes from a particular machine image. It's great for day one, but what happens on day two when you might want to make configuration changes? So we've actually are adding technologies that allows you to keep the immutability over time as the system needs to get maintained and updated. So that's something that eases the day-to-day management and improves the security of the system, because every time you restart the system, you go back to a known state. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. Okay, so the other piece that we kind of wanted to address was this notion of what we call deep infrastructure. So what is deep infrastructure versus what we call shallow infrastructure? The shallow infrastructure is really what is quite common across all the server vendors, right? You have a CPU, you have the OS that is running, And that's what we call shallow infrastructure. But it turns out a server is really made up of a lot more than just the CPU and the OS that is running on it. There's a heck of a lot of other pieces of hardware that is running below that CPU. You think about your peripherals, your network card, your storage card, the BIOS, the UEFI, the BMC. All those have firmware that is running on the card. And in fact, for the system to work, they all kind of have, in fact, all that pieces of firmware has to get going prior to the OS even running on that system. Now, while there's a lot of commonalities with what we call the shallow infrastructure, it's either AMD or Intel, it's either Windows or VMware. When it comes to deep infrastructure, there is a plethora of different pieces of hardware running out there. There's hardware from Broadcom, Micron, in NVIDIA. If you're talking about Intel, it's got its own set of, if you're talking about a network card, there are loads of different network cards with different firmware. If you're talking about SSD, there's lots of firmware. So it turns out that managing deep infrastructure in a heterogeneous environment is quite difficult. Okay, so somebody like AWS or hypercloud providers, because they have a homogeneous environment, they have the same server with the same BOM that is getting replicated over and over again in their data center. The management of this deep infrastructure is a little easier, just because it's actually a lot easier, just because they know on every server exactly what hardware is there and what sort of firmware should be running on that hardware. But in the enterprise, you're buying servers from different vendors with different type of peripherals, and therefore all that firmware is subject to change and different from one rack to the next rack. So how do you manage this environment in a heterogeneous way? And so that's what we also aim to do, is the idea of manage that part of the infrastructure, so that you have we talked about kind of immutability from an OS perspective, but you really want an immutable environment for all the firmware that is running as enablers for the rest of the software stack, right? Because if every time you're coming up, the firmware is a little different from one server to the server to the other server, you're subject to both security and stability vulnerabilities. All right. So, the security becomes, a big headache for everyone. And so the security can be addressed in a lot of different places. In fact, it needs to be addressed in a lot of different places. One of it is just kind of network security, perimeter security, but increasingly folks are moving into what we call a zero trust security model. And the zero trust security model, the idea behind it is that every user has to be authenticated exactly for the application or resource that they actually want to use. So there's a lot of research has been done in that area, and people are moving in that direction. But there is a lot more that needs to occur at the infrastructure level to ensure that this zero trust is applicable to the entire environment. So in our model, we have series of kind of zero trust pieces of security that we've introduced into the infrastructure. One is what we call zero touch. The idea behind this is, this is all centralized remote fleet management as a service. So when you're composing the application, it just gets the exact same application instance every time. So you don't have to go and individually manage and essentially, create the potential of drift in the configuration. It guarantees, a secure, delivery of applications, reliably and repeatably. You could do this. There's a notion of zero drift. If you're if you're restarting your server, and every time you restart the server, it comes back with an immutable instance of the OS, then the OS cannot be changed, and therefore there is no drift happening in the system over time. This gives you an unmatched level of availability. Imagine if your servers is impacted either by malware or some system administrator that really shouldn't have installed a patch. If you kind of restart the system, it goes back into a known configuration that the system architect has decided is the standard for the enterprise. That's the idea behind zero drift on day one, and over time, every time the system gets restarted. The second piece is zero dependency. The fewer software pieces you install in the OS, the better you are. And by isolating default domains and creating our card in a way that doesn't require drivers or additional softwares or agents inside the server. You reduce the dependencies, and therefore you just, that leads to a much better overall availability model, because you don't have to worry about updating drivers and firmwares. And it also reduces the actual load on the CPU, because the services that would ordinarily be running on the server is running on the card. You can actually free up those cores to actually run your application, as opposed to additional services that really should be running in an independent domain inside the card itself. And the last but not least is the idea of zero trust, the idea that the data should be encrypted without you having to think about it. And if the drives are walking away from your data center, how much of your data is really walking away? So the data, the encryption should just be on by default, not just for your data, but also for your boot volumes. So you have the certainty that when the data gets, when the server is getting decommissioned, in fact, the data cannot be accessed, or if it drive gets replaced, you don't have to worry about, okay, do I have some critical data leaving the enterprise because of it? And this really needs to happen. Just if it's difficult to implement, people just won't implement it. It has to be built into the system on day one when you actually get it going. We also are adding a ransomware recovery all from the cloud. And the way the ransomware recovery model works, because the card is running all the storage services, and it can keep track of what has been changing, you can actually go to the cloud and say, take my system back to the day before yesterday. So you literally send a set of instructions to the system, and because the card is controlling all the state, including the boot state, it can take the entire system back to a known good state in time. That's fundamentally different from other solutions that either you have to use the backup, or if you're using snapshots, that only applies to the data but not to the system state itself, and not to the running system. Since we serve both the data and the boot services, we can take the entire system back to a known good state. And when we talk to the customers that either have dealt with ransomware or are worried about ransomware impacting, the idea of just being single button recovery is something that they find quite attractive. Okay, with that, any questions on it, on any of what we've talked about so far? And then
okay, I'm going to pause you right there and do the first of your polls for you.
Sure.
So I'm launching this now. So which of the following do you believe will be a priority for IT organizations in 2022? Select all that apply. Okay, I am going to pause the poll there. And here are the results. Can you see that, Siamak?
Yes, we can. So it's interesting. So the question was, which of the following do you believe will be a priority for IT organizations in 2022? 59% say accelerating time to service. This is kind of the premise of the cloud. Centralizing administration of distributed HA infrastructure, that's 23%. Reducing infrastructure operational cost, 82%. Reducing infrastructure footprint, resource requirements, 27%. Protecting infrastructure against data breaches and ransomware, that's 100%. That's interesting. So all of those are areas that we actually are pushing hard on. So this is great. Thanks. All right. With that, Tim, let's talk about go-to-market and progress we've made there.
Thank you, Siamak. So thanks, folks. Thanks for joining us today. I'm the only person from the Nebulon team that's based in London. So if I fall asleep or sound tired, then there's really no excuse. So so what I thought I'd do now is just give you a quick update on where we are in terms of go-to-market. We're a good while now into building our product. In terms of selling our product and taking it to market, and we've had a very interesting year over the last 12 months or last 18 months since we talked to you last, and also a very exciting year in the conversations and the sales we've had with customers. So the next slide please, Siamak. So you've heard Siamak talk about our technology and our vision and where we're where we're taking our company from that perspective. But when you talk to customers, obviously the conversation breaks down into how do they want to actually consume and deploy a new technology, and what is it that they look for. And in customers' minds, they look at their business in different use cases or in different projects that they have that come up at different times. So when we talk about the ultimate value of where Nebulon can go, if someone were replatforming and thinking radically about their entire business, that's a great end game. But what's the journey that they go on, and how do they get there? And that it breaks down essentially into 5 key use cases that are based upon a simple and fundamental proposition. And in the reports that Siamak, the first one is obviously the operations focused transformation in terms of delivering a cloud operating platform that's on the same as the public cloud, same benefits, same value as the public cloud on premise. And if you think about the reports that Siamak was talking about earlier, you could argue, in fact, one of them uses the phrase a revolving door. You know, we're not saying for one second that everything's moving out of the cloud or that there is any fundamental shift away from cloud technologies. But as customers become more mature in terms of their deployment of applications and data sets in the cloud, they do understand that there are certain applications are much better suited to the cloud, and certain applications aren't. And for cost and compliance reasons, very often you're seeing this revolving door where some things are going into the cloud and some things are coming back. And that target of customer very much sees the benefit of a cloud operating model that they can leverage across their entire estate, where they've got a cloud control plane and it's incredibly simple to use and deploy technology. But if you look at the other 5 use cases, they're really focused on the core enterprise businesses of today. So you know, we're not focused on any sort of high performance compute environment. This is very much for customers today in terms of how they think about deploying mainstream technologies across their data center and mainstream services for their internal or external user communities. So clearly focused on VMware, everything is virtualized today. So operating you know, as customers look to modernize their VMware environments, leveraging cloud technologies such as Nebulon, then this is a perfect starting point. We see that continually nowadays, whether it be coming off traditional 3-tier architectures or HCI-like platforms. Smart Edge, this is focused on edge technology. As you will have seen many reports talking about 40% of IT spend being very much at the edge of networks over the next 12 months or so. Having an offering at the edge when you've got simple fleet management that allows you to see your entire estate from exactly the same control plane in the cloud gives you the ability to view the edge and the core in exactly the same way. And that's very unusual nowadays to be able to do that. Very often it's different technology deployed at the edge as opposed to the core of the data center. And we really fix that problem and move away from it. Moving on to Kubernetes, clearly critical as everyone looks at containerized environments today. And smart infrastructure as service for cloud service providers. We'll talk about a use case. We'll talk about that use case in a little more detail with a reference customer at the end of this, at the end of my section. But the ability for us to be able to offer infrastructure as a service in a way that is designed and built in the way that cloud providers and the hyperscalers today build their modular technology that they can operate at massive scale and manage simply from the cloud is critical for service providers and allows them to deploy new services more rapidly and also more cost-efficient services, which means that they can deploy new, better margin-rich services that offer a better solution for their customers. And interestingly, in the survey that we just had, you know, ransomware and our smart instance solution is really, really topical and something that really evidences the whole concept of smart infrastructure and us being able to manage deep infrastructure environments. So this is on everybody's lips today. Everyone's talking about it. And the recent surveys that I'm sure you're aware of that we're not actually touching on here, but the you know, companies today simply know that they are going to have a ransomware attack over the next 18 months. And they know that it's going to take them between 20 and 30 days to be able to recover from that. So the time saving, the value around time that we can bring back for customers with our smart instance for ransomware use case and solution is is really, really compelling. And we're at a number of live events. They're starting to come back now, starting next week with Cloud Expo, and we're really looking forward to being able to talk to people about that. So
Tim,
one of the
sorry,
big...
Tim, this is Fred. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
We have a question in the chat that I was hoping I could ask you if you are the right person. It's from analyst Martin Hingley, and Martin is asking, what proportion of your customers use VMware versus other hypervisors such as KVM? Do any of them want to change?
The vast majority of our customers at the moment are VMware customers. We do see a lot of customers questioning pricing and questioning certain frustrations, but we're not seeing a radical shift away from VMware or anything like that. And we very much, you know, I mean, it's such a massive dominant market player that for us, this is absolutely the right place to go. What we do see on occasion is customers running more than one hypervisor, depending where they are in their infrastructure. But really, it's all VMware.
And we have a follow-up question. This is from Roy Ilsley at Omdia, another analyst. Roy is saying, building on Martin's question, is this growing or declining?
Is what growing or declining? People moving away from VMware? Is that really the question?
Roy, can you?
Yeah, Tim, are people moving away from VMware off virtual machines to Kubernetes, or are you seeing it as flat and stable, or are you actually seeing more people coming back to using virtual machines?
So I can take that. What we do see is a lot of customers tiptoeing and for the first time beginning to look at Kubernetes as means of running their applications. But because of the nature of the heterogeneous nature of the enterprises, often they have Linux application, Windows applications. They still, a significant number of them are still continuing to deploy VMware. But a number of them are looking at when they do new applications, they do want to make sure that, you know, we live in a hybrid world. They want to be able to actually deploy it both in the cloud and a data center. So new applications, increasingly people are looking at deploying them using Kubernetes, but that is still kind of at the leading edge where they're looking at implementing new applications where it comes into play. On the question of Tanzu versus, you know, kind of native Kubernetes, and what we find is the larger the organization, the more likely is for them to actually look at Kubernetes native, because they're actually, the goal of the organization is to have cost savings by moving away from VMware and having you know, native Kubernetes for both performance and cost reasons. But the small organizations that just don't have the large enough engineering staff to be able to deal with deploying new infrastructure, they tend to look at Tanzu, and they tend to actually be, you know, less interested in moving. It's just the cost of moving is very high for them. So that's kind of been our observation when we talk to customers.
Tim, back to you, please.
Thank you. Yeah, and of course, from our perspective, the critical thing is to be open to all different hypervisors, all different applications, any application, any hypervisor at the core, at the edge, at any given time is our offer. So yeah, so that's how customers think about breaking out. That's how they deploy. So it's critical, and this is a major development in the way that we think about our go-to-market since we talked last. Is this break into looking at the world through these specific use cases and customer identified projects. Next slide, please. So this is strategically important to us, and was one of the founding principles of Nebulon, was really in terms of how we go to market. The idea, I mean, as you've got a couple of different offerings really, and opportunities really, and one of them is for us to do what a lot of companies do, and that is go and build a massive global sales organization, and with all the peripheral parts that come with that in terms of core technical resources in the field. But because we're essentially, the SPU is server embedded, it became very obvious to us that what we wanted to be able to do is not go down that initial path, but to work exclusively in partnership with OEMs and with their pathways to market, so with their networks and their partners. And this has got a number of critical benefits for us, for our partners, and also critically critically for our customers as well. Firstly, it means that we get to really architect our company around this model, and it really is a matter of architecting it in that way, and making sure that we're building resources and partnership resources that are focused on the success of our partners. For our partners, of course, what it means is they get to take new innovative technology to market that is embedded in their host. But for customers, it's fantastic. One of the things that really does kill startups is this whole concept of trying to take something new to a customer that they then have to build, new supply chains for, new contracts, and it becomes very expensive to take on new vendors. And we've heard over the years how often customers are trying to reduce the number of vendors that they have in their stack because it de-risks it, but also reduces the cost that they have to expend on that. Critically, also in terms of support agreements and making sure that their platforms are supported by adding more technology in there, you're increasing the complexity, and you've got more chance of breaking something that you're trying something else while you're trying to fix something with new technology that you're bringing to market. So if you consider it as part of the technology adoption lifecycle, we give customers the opportunity to deploy new, innovative, cost-reducing technology much more early than they otherwise would do because they can buy it under their existing server vendor contracts. And we're seeing tremendous success with this. It's highly valuable to us, but we're really seeing the benefit of the value with our customers as well. So next slide, please. As part of the partner program, we've built an incentive program for what we refer to as our smart partner.
Hello, sorry, I'm a bit late. I was in a call with some others.
Okay, welcome. So we've this is an invitation-only smart partner program for strategic resellers, and all these resellers are part of the network of our OEM partners. So we're not signing up new partners. There's no contracts that take place or anything like that. So this is purely in terms of education and incentives and certification for those partners as they choose to go to market, because effectively they will buy.
Yes, Andy, over to
Yeah, it
you.
was really just, I think, going back to the previous slide with a lot of the OEM partners, the usual like Dell, HP and Lenovo, but of course they've got quite a few different partnerships, particularly with the likes of Nutanix, etc. So I was just really wondering what you're doing to really try and get mind share and momentum within, say, the sales team and the marketing team within these OEMs to really be able to compete against the likes of Nutanix, which of course is also trying to move into the cloud compute and storage space here as well.
So that's a great question. And thank you for asking it, because that is obviously one of the most fundamentally important things that we need to be capable of doing. And firstly, the one thing that you don't do is try and eat the elephant, as it were. You've got to break it into component parts and target on teams where we are most likely to be successful. So where we have seen real success, for example, with managed service providers and things like that, then we continue to mine that, because you increase your chances of success. You also when you get into conversations with these partners, one of the real advantages that we have of a model like this is that we've got a very, very clean model. There's absolutely no confusion in terms of how we go to market, and every company that we compete with is somewhat confused in that they've got some customers they sell directly to, they've got other customers that they sell through one partner, and all our competitors really, in many ways, particularly if you look at Nutanix and vSAN and these things, one could argue that they're highly distributed, even over distributed. So very often, our partners will be competing with countless other companies that are selling Nutanix, whereas if they're positioning Nebulon, then they're going to be positioning a unique solution. It's worth saying that when you're getting going with partners, some are further ahead than others as well. So we have some partners we're doing a bit better with. Some of them are a little slower on the uptake, which is perfectly natural. And also all our materials that we do in terms of education, in terms of how we provide information to the teams is all readily available. So, we understand where we fit with Nutanix and how we compete with them and where we would typically win and why we would typically win. And so that information is shared with very much with our partners as well. So, but it's easier for us in so much as if you choose this to be your pathway, you really can differentiate yourself quite specifically and very, very well. It's worth pointing out that when we talk a little bit, I've got a high level on a case study in a minute. In fact, if we move to that slide now.
So
Tim,
before we go there, yeah, just 1 second. I just want to kind of add a little color to that question. I think the way we think about this, adoption requires what I call both a pull and a push model, right? And the push model, essentially, the idea is go with the OEMs to the customers that they already are serving. And that's when they're comfortable with us, they're taking us to the customer. But you really have to also produce what I call a pull from the customer, asking their OEMs, I want this technology. So that requires having a specific, very differentiated set of technologies and features that it is difficult for people to actually get from anybody else. So for instance, the idea of doing it from the cloud, essentially instantaneous recovery from ransomware by going back to a point in time for the entire application, both data and boot, for instance, that's a very differentiated set of technologies, right? And when the customers hear about it, and then we will show you in a few minutes what it all looks like, that's a differentiated technology that they can't get from anybody else. That's where actual pull is created, and then pull leads to push over time. So that's kind of on the technology side. On the business side, we have a business case that will show why the OEMs can win with us in a very differentiated way, just kind of in the transaction part of the conversation, and that becomes kind of a little more obvious when we talk about a specific customer.
Okay, thank you very much, Siamak. Tim, we have 2 more questions. So one is from Mary, possibly 3. Mary Branscombe. The question is, I wanted to ask, you talk about bringing cloud services to your own infrastructure, but this is just infrastructure as a service and similar services, not the full range of cloud services. Or do you have support for any of the public cloud hybrid programs where you can, where you can run a public cloud service locally? And then in brackets, Mary mentions Anthos and Arc.
So that's a fantastic question. Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So you're absolutely correct. We are not pretending by any stretch of imagination that we are bringing the plethora of services that somebody like AWS brings, because the way you think about the cloud service providers, there is the infrastructure piece that they actually give you, but there's also the application services that they give you. This is what we call, Amazon machine images are essentially our means of instantiating particular services. So we are not we are enabling the customers to instantiate the instances that is specific to the customer. We are not actually bringing, database services. We are not doing Redshift. We are not competing at that level. And the reason, the way we think about this is, if you go talk to a large enterprise, right, the machine image instance that they run is crafted for that customer, right? So if you go to a large financial like JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley, they have a lot of different agents, security protocols that is kind of built into that machine image, and that's what they want to deploy. They don't want to deploy your thing. They want to deploy their corporate standard, but they just want to make the infrastructure itself to go away and be able to be managed as at scale. So that's kind of our goal. Our goal is not to bring, the copy and paste version of some service in the cloud into the data center.
Okay, excellent. We have one more question. This is from Simon Bisson. Simon is asking, there's an interesting trend that I've noted around application-driven infrastructure. What APIs and the like, sorry, I keep on losing what APIs and the like do you have for application developers to deploy declarative infrastructure with offset guardrails? And then Simon says, I'm thinking about tooling like Pulumi and the like, which are increasingly important to app teams.
That's a great question. In fact, that's one of the in fact that's a perfect way to describe the goal. It's to be to build declarative infrastructure. And in fact, the way we think about deploying a pod of infrastructure, rather than thinking about I want to install this, I want to add that, you want to say I'm going to run a Oracle instance, or I want to run SQL Server or some application, and then you just say just run it on that physical piece of hardware, and the declarative infrastructure is supposed to go and figure out what's available, deploy the OS, deploy the agents, and then after having all that, be able to monitor what that application stack is actually doing and report it to the cloud. So you can actually see an end-to-end model, what the infrastructure is providing and what the application is doing. So that is our definition of declarative infrastructure, and a significant part of our work in the cloud is exactly around that, an API-driven model that you could say essentially, this is what I want done, this is the hardware I want to use it for, go build it. And and I think, Tobias, do you have anything you want to add to this?
No, that's absolutely spot on, and I can touch on that a little bit more in my section when I talk about recent announcements around automation.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, let's go today.
We
talked about, yep,
incentives.
go ahead.
Okay, so relating this directly back to the question around what are we doing, how do we differentiate ourselves? This is a major win with one of our OEMs that is actually going to be showcased. They have their big internal kickoff event coming up, and this is one of the key sales presentations when they talk about successes that they've had. And the primary reason is that this particular OEM was selling hosts but weren't involved in any of the other infrastructure at all, particularly on the storage infrastructure, which is a three-tier architecture. So partnering with Nebulon, it enabled them to go and win the storage estate, collapse the three-tier architecture, and massively increase the revenue opportunity for the OEM. So the opportunity went up, roughly speaking, in terms of size by about 140%, and became a multi-million-dollar opportunity for the OEM, as opposed to it being simply a server transaction. So it put them in a much stronger competitive situation. And secondly, they were able to increase the margins, increase the revenues, and now they're in a much stronger position within the account as well, because these guys, this OEM owns the majority of the infrastructure estate. In fact, pretty much all of it. And as a consequence, if there are any changes, anything going on, these guys get the first call. I apologize that we can't use the logo of this particular customer at the moment, but we will be able to soon. So we'll be able to follow up with this if you want to, because we're actually in the middle of putting together the case study. And once the case study is done and approved, we'll be able to talk about it. But it was three-tier current estate. It's a major service provider, and that you can read for yourself. The project scope was they were coming to end of life. They wanted to radically rethink and use current technology. The profile of this particular service provider is someone that likes to look at new technology and do things that are different. They were very keen on looking at the service offerings that they had and making them more profitable, and also making them more performant for them in terms of how it operates within their business. They're always looking at reducing operational cost as well. It's a massive thing for them, is reducing operational cost. They go across a number of continents, certainly Europe and North America, and we will be deployed as part of the OEM project across both continents, but multiple countries. And the customer benefit is really significant savings. And on the services that they're offering, their margin opportunity is increased. And as a consequence, it gives them more flexibility in their pricing model. So they're very keen on new customer acquisition benefits that they that they think they can get. So the customer value is really, really clear and understood, and this customer, like I say, is going to be very public about that. It is worth pointing out that we've invested, if you think about smart infrastructure as a service, we've invested very heavily in this as a use case for Nebulon, as a real proof point for our company. And we brought people in with real expertise in this market, so we position ourselves to this use case incredibly well. But for this particular OEM as well, it's something that they're absolutely delighted with, and they're using it to promote within that service provider business that they have this particular success, which obviously is tremendously beneficial.
So Tim, this is Kimberly Bates. Question on this win: is this a change for the server vendor as well? In other words, so when you guys we were competing, let's say the original guys were a Dell infrastructure, 3-tier infrastructure, and this is now going over to an HPE infrastructure. So
great question.
Was there an initiative here for HPE or whoever won the deal to go in there with a totally different structure and reset the thing, or was the original firm willing to reset the concept?
So they had multiple server vendors. The winning server vendor was able to consolidate it all, is the way to put it. They were already in, they were already working there, but what they were able to do was to bring it, be the primary server vendor. I mean, the way servers are often bought is, particularly for larger server consumers, they'll have relationships with a number of them, and they shop around for it. So these guys have become the primary platform now and pretty much consolidated everything onto their platform.
So in the sales effort, did you actually have multiple server vendors pitching you?
That's a great question. So on this one, no, but in other opportunities, we've started to see that. I mean, obviously we're early, but we certainly think that if you go forward a year, 2 years, that will be the case. In fact, where we think maybe the ultimate expression of where we can get to is that, if you think about what we can do in terms of immutability, and if you think about the clear value in terms of infrastructure as a service, you may find that supporting Nebulon as part of your offering becomes a condition of right to play in that opportunity.
And that's what I was looking for. What inflection point are you sitting? Because if you get to that inflection point, then all of a sudden, the game completely changes for you guys. Because I say I'm going to move off of this architecture to a brand new architecture, and Mr. Dell, Supermicro, Lenovo, if you want to play, you got to pitch Nebulon. So that's a totally different conversation, which I'm sure you want to be thrown in that briar patch for. So look at Siamak, he's smiling big time. I don't think I've seen him smile that much in a long time.
I mean, that's where we want to get to, but but it is definitely an inflection point that we're looking for, and there comes, there's a lot of stuff you have to think about internally to get there as well, in terms of making sure you've got fair playing fields. But it's also, to Siamak's point around, there's the push and the pull. We have customer conversations. We're doing a lot of this as well, and as we build our business out, we'll be very, very sales light and far more technically driven in terms of supporting other people's sales teams. The way that we build our messaging, for example, is that next level of simplicity, so that people who are portfolio sellers can take our product and our platform to market. So we have to think about that continually, which is why it's really interesting that when you think about this as a go-to-market model, it's kind of an all-in thing. You sort of can't say, right, we'll do a bit of it and then go elsewhere, because it just muddies the water and confuses everybody. Okay. That's me done. So I'll hand over to Tobias.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim.
Sorry, Tobias, before you get going, as you're getting ready for the demo, let's do the second of your polls. Just to give people a little bit. Okay, here's question number 2. Which of the following capabilities are most important to end users? And you need to select your top 2. Okay, I'm going to end the poll here, and here are your results. I don't know, Tim, if you want to talk through this, or Tobias.
Sure, I can talk to those. So the question was, which of the following capabilities are most important to end users? And you were selecting the top two, and I think the ones that I see here standing out is consistent, predictable deployments for any application, and I think this is something that we hear from customers a lot, specifically in environments where there's hundreds and thousands of servers, so large scale environments, where there's a challenge to figure out, have I done all of the things that I need to do to secure my infrastructure, but also in edge deployments where it's various different locations and being able to provision infrastructure there and keeping infrastructure up and running in all of these separate locations and getting that done consistently. Always on availability is I think the second one in line, which is I guess a fundamental aspect when it comes to enterprise infrastructure. The next one is the infrastructure-wide recovery from ransomware or malware. I think that's also something that we're seeing great interest in when it comes to our customer conversations, and it's one of the things that you always see in the news, right? It's coming up everywhere. Can read articles about how ransomware brought down entire companies, or is actually is involved in politics as well, as we're seeing in the news right now. Across the pond in the European area. So, right, thank you for that. With that said, right, we're coming now to the third section. Can you still share your, the slides, the three slides there, Siamak,
Sure.
that I have there? But yeah, we're coming to the third section. So Siamak talked about the company strategy, the company vision, and our direction in where we're going, and Tim gave you an update of our current state and our current go-to-market. And what I'll be focusing on in the last section here is really giving you a little bit of a sneak peek what we have in store in the next couple of weeks, and what we're going to announce more broadly, and things that we're going to hammer on in a couple of weeks a lot more. So you'll get a sneak peek of what we're basically announcing. So Siamak, if you go to the next slide. Before I get into what we're about to announce, the sneak preview, I'll just quickly summarize what we've recently announced to paint you a better picture in terms of our execution towards our vision. So smart infrastructure is our core solution, our product, and we're talking about smart infrastructure now since it's close to a year. We're no longer just talking about data services or data storage. As you can see from Siamak's picture that he was painting around where we are going around this cloud operating platform, covering more than just data services, but infrastructure more broadly, giving customers the tools and the technology to build a cloud-like experience for their on-premises infrastructure, whether it's in the core data center or at the edge. And around smart infrastructure, we're building solution blueprints or reference architectures that are specifically tailored towards certain use cases that help our customers to understand and to really take advantage of the smart infrastructure benefits for their specific deployment. In that realm, we have quite recently announced a smart infrastructure as a service reference architecture blueprint, which is specifically tailored towards cloud service providers to, on the one hand, reduce their infrastructure spend, both on when it comes to footprint, rack space, or just simply infrastructure costs, but also reduce spend when it comes to their operational effort. And one of the things that is really key there is automation and the as a service delivery of smart infrastructure for those service providers. In addition to that, while these aspects are great for customers to improve their service delivery of their hosted environments, as in the infrastructure that they own in their own data center, this smart infrastructure as a service solution also helps customers acquire and breach into new deployment models. For example, we have one service provider that is trying to provide managed services for a financial institution with infrastructure that is customer owned in the customer's data center. However, the struggle into acquiring this opportunity was to be on the customer's network, right? They were not allowed on this customer's network. But with the smart IaaS solution, with its out-of-band, zero-touch, remote, and secure management capabilities, we give these service providers abilities to not only manage their own infrastructure in their own data centers, but also and deliver managed services for infrastructure that is actually in customers' data center with the same APIs, with the same control, security that they get for their own data center. Now, Smart Edge is a solution blueprint around, edge deployments, distributed applications, distributed infrastructure, where the single API, the single control plane in the cloud is particularly useful to essentially manage and deploy this infrastructure, to monitor that infrastructure, and basically keep that distributed infrastructure up and running. Within that space, edge deployments are particularly, restricted when it comes to infrastructure footprint, rack space. So around this smart edge solution, we have announced a 2-node high availability support, where customers can start with just a 2-node configuration, a 2-node high available configuration based on smart infrastructure. And unlike other solutions that are out there in the market around hyperconverged infrastructure, or even 3-tier architectures, this is again is built on this notion of zero touch, zero configuration, where customers don't have to worry about complicated setups of quorum witnesses that make sure that the 2 nodes work well, or they don't have to deploy a third server to act as a breaking boat. So that allows customers to really lower their footprint and obviously lower their costs when it comes to distributed scenarios, distributed infrastructure deployments. If you think about hundreds to thousands of stores, these costs add up quickly. And the most recent announcement that we had, and I think Simon had a question around APIs earlier, is our Ansible collection, the Nebulon Ansible collection that allows Ansible users to use Ansible to automate everything smart infrastructure. And now you're probably thinking, well, everyone has an Ansible collection. What's so special about the Nebulon Ansible collection? And the one thing that I would want to call out there as something that is special is that our collection, our Ansible collection, enables customers to now just use a single tool to deploy and manage infrastructure from the bare metal server to the full running application stack with just one framework, which is in this case Ansible. So Ansible is very good when it comes to operating system configuration, when it comes to application configuration. Siamak talked about Nebulon machine images and templatized deployment of infrastructure. We are very good at bringing infrastructure to the point where Ansible can take over. So the combination of Nebulon's automation capabilities with Ansible's operating system application configuration capabilities really allows customers to just use one automation framework for their end-to-end deployments, which of course saves skill sets and at the end of the day money and pain. Now, these are the recent announcements, and you can read all about them online. So let me get into the things that we're about to announce. So, Siamak, if you go to the next slide. Thank you. So there's really two things that you'll hear from us in a lot more detail over the coming weeks. One is our server management integration, where our Nebulon on cloud control plane is now starting to actually administrate the servers rather than the Nebulon specific solution components. And that is useful for customers that have a large fleet of server hardware, want to do inventory, patch management, identifying where in the infrastructure do I have which infrastructure deployed, what's their patch levels, is there any vulnerability across my fleet of servers. With that integration, we're also starting to get control over the server's power state, which is particularly useful for the next item here, which is an ability to instantly recover entire application clusters. And we talked about it a little bit earlier. Tim talked about Smart Instance and the necessity to provide customers with great tooling to protect and recover from ransomware attacks, from misconfiguration, and help them out when it comes to an infrastructure crisis. And there's probably many solutions out there, and it is our belief that this is the first real solution that solves this problem on a more holistic basis. It is not requiring complicated tasks in a matter of crisis, or is only covering portions of the infrastructure. Now, it's probably best to just give a quick demo about those two things, and that gives a little bit more clarity and detail about what that actually means. So, Siamak, if you stop sharing, and I'll start sharing. And while I set this up, why don't I ask for if there's any question right now?
All right, let me jump in. So I would like to say, first of all, welcome to those of you who just joined us. But also, as you guys may or may know, the company is very young. So if you haven't spoken to Nebulon before, please do ask, even if you have questions about the background of the company, not necessarily about what we've just seen in terms of product, because I know that many of you maybe have not positioned Nebulon in their minds yet with regard to where they sit in the industry, with regard to different ways of categorizing the industry. So if you do have any questions, please do ask, and you're welcome to ask here, or you can ask using the chat, whichever way you prefer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so jumping into the demo. So what we're looking at here is an example of the smallest configuration that we have, which is a 2-node cluster. And these are 2 servers, 2 bare metal servers running Windows Server, and we have a failover cluster here. And you can basically see these are the 2 nodes, and I've connected to those. You can see that I have a Microsoft SQL Server, high available role running there. So this is a typical setup that you'll find with a high available Microsoft SQL server cluster. And what I've also done here is I've added some data into that database, and you can see that there's a bunch of records in there, and I can connect to that database, and I can interact with that data here, right? So this is an example, as you'll find everywhere in the in various different deployments. So as I said, it's built from 2 nodes, 2 physical servers, and what you'll also see, there's a couple of storage devices there. We have a quorum disk that breaks the load between the 2 servers, and we have the drive that backs the SQL server. So this is where the SQL server data is being stored. Now, let me just start simulating an attack, right? So first of all, don't do this at home, right? So what I'll do is I have a little script here that is basically simulating an attack of ransomware. So if I start this off, you can see that there's a little bit of output there, and it is basically a process that is going through the file system and is simulating the similar thing that a ransomware would do, and is basically encrypting all of your data. And you can see that this one is already stopping, and I'm losing control over these servers. At this point, my remote desktop sessions are broken, well, because I'm under attack. So what I'll do in this point is I'll go to the remote console, right, the server's lights out management tool, in this case ILO from these HPE servers, and you can even see that the server 6 here is actually crashing, right? It's rebooting already. If I go back to my database, you can see that I have lost access, right? You can argue, all right, well, this is a high available cluster. Shouldn't there be a failover? So wait a few seconds and, you know, there's a failover. But as you can see, I've started the scripts on both nodes. So in this case, both nodes are infected. Both nodes are, you know, part of a ransomware attack. And this is something that is not unusual with ransomware, because ransomware often sits dormant in your infrastructure, you know, is seeking for vulnerabilities and is trying to you know, find other systems that have leaked passwords or have not the latest security patches, and would slowly walk vertically or horizontally, I should say, in the network until it, you know, finds a place where it can do most damage. In this case, you know, it was damaging this this two node cluster, and you know, was encrypting that file system. It even got to the point where this system here crashed. Now, with that said, let me just quickly wait for these servers to come up again, if they come up again. But while we wait for that, I want to show you how this two-node cluster actually looks like in our Nebulon on Cloud Console. And here I have a pre-release of our next version of our user interface. We're looking at the same cluster, and you can see that this cluster is made out of 2 physical servers. I can see the same server 5 and server 6. We can see that the Nebulon data plane, provides a couple of storage volumes to those servers. In this case, you can see that there are 2 operating system volumes that each are mounted to each server. This is where Windows is booting from. We can see the quorum disk that is showed in the failover cluster manager, and you can see the data disk, which is where the SQL Server data is being stored. So all of those are basically served from the Nebulon data plane. Now, if I go back to the server, we can see this one is up again. So let's see what we can do there. Right, I said there was a ransomware attack, so the first thing that I'm trying to do is go to the console and try to recover from there. But you can see, well, I can't log into that server anymore. Well, this is maybe because I'm not using, you know, a local administrator account. So let's try that one more time with, you know, the local administrator account. That is basically my fallback user account when it comes to recovering that that system. In this case, I put in the wrong password, I guess. Oh, admins. There you go. That looks better. So if I'm getting into the system, you're like, I can log in, and now I would start the recovery, right? In the 3-tier architecture, I'd go to my snapshot, recover my snapshot, roll that back, and I have my data back, right? Problem is, well, where's my SQL server? Where are my application binaries? So looking at the system now, you can see there's not really anything. I can't really start anything. Task manager doesn't seem to be responding. So at this point, I'm like, well, there it is. I would be like, all right, let me go and see what's going on by starting a new process. But you can also see there's no labels, no buttons, nothing going on there. So at this point, I'm like, okay, I need to reinstall Windows. I need to reinstall the operating system to recover from this state, right? And recovering of the operating system is usually a lengthy task, right? I have to mount the ISO, and boot from the ISO and do all of the installation procedure. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're introducing a new feature, which is this instant cluster recovery capability. And let me show you how that works really quickly in the Nebulon world. So I'll set a timer here so we can see how fast it is. So in our UI, I have this restore endpod option, and you can see that we have a couple of recovery points for this cluster, and I'll take the one from last night here, and all I have to do is, let's start this timer, is click on recover, right? And what is happening now, it is essentially pausing all I/O of the two servers, creating a recovery point, and is looking at prior recovery points and is rolling that back, rebooting the server, bringing the system back to a known good state. Now this will take a few seconds, so while we wait for that recovery to complete, let me show you a little bit about our server integration, the other feature. Yeah.
Hi there, it's Ulrika. I'm sorry, I have a question about the recovery points. Is there any possibility to really check if this is still uncompromised data? Because you know that we have malware that have this little time bomb integrated, and let's say from the surface you're never sure. So is there any option that you can offer?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this is kind of the first part of our implementation is to roll back to a known point in time. We are implementing a set of features in the cloud. We are sending telemetry information continuously to the cloud, and we are developing some tools around monitoring the entropy of the data from one snapshot to the next snapshot. And we will be able to detect potentially questionable activity between 2 points in time and raise an alert and tell the customer that we see a manifest change in the entropy of the data, and therefore we could potentially infer that you may have been impacted earlier, and we could actually kind of try and pinpoint the time and suggest to a customer a point in time recovery. Ultimately, this is something that the customer has to get, restore and verify the data, but we think there is enough signature of an attack that can be detected by watching those aspects and then be able to actually infer information from that.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely.
I have a question about the consistency of those snapshots. How do you manage them? Because you make a snapshot of a cluster. Do you have some OS or application integration, or just you define a time window where you stop the service and make the snapshot, and then you have consistency?
Right. So, yeah. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrea, for that question. So, right now, what you see these restore points that I'm using here, these are crash consistent. As I said, this is a preview, like a preview of a feature that we're releasing. Same time, specifically for Windows, we are working on a volume shadow service integration. So that we can pause I/O and make it a consistent snapshot, right? So in this case, we're just see this is a crash consistent snapshot. So it would behave the same way as if the servers would have undergone a reboot or a crash for that matter, and come back from that, right? But once the VSS, the shadow copy service integration for specifically Windows is there, those would be application consistent. So no log replace would be required, right? All right, yeah, thank you for those questions. Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if Rachel, okay, so Rachel just said that there's a question that's not been answered, I believe. Rachel, do you want to read out the question that Chris sent, please?
Any integration with supplier server management functions?
And this is from Chris Mello.
Yeah, we actually it just saw in the background that these servers have rebooted. And actually, I stopped the clock. Just, but I'll answer the question. But I had to stop the clock because we're back, right? But yeah, so you saw the servers reboot as part of this recovery procedure. So we are actually integrating with the servers management tools to facilitate those actions. So we're basically leveraging server management capabilities to interact with the servers. This is also what's fueling the inventory in the Nebulon on cloud about the server. Nevertheless, so you can see this is just under 4 minutes, and again, as I showed you, right, the database is back. I can interact with my data here again, and if I open up my remote desktop connection, it is all back. If I go to my failover cluster manager here again, you can see that my role is here back online. Can see the resources are there. My database is back. So basically, in less than 4 minutes, I have recovered the entire operating system. I have recovered the SQL Server data, that was basically under attack from ransomware, and it was basically a single, button press for recovering that entire cluster. Now, the one thing that I've...
Sorry, Tobias, we have another question. This one is from David Norfolk. And David is asking, if you roll back to a known point in time before a ransomware attack started, what do you do about stuff you cannot roll back? Payments to third parties, etc. Manual remediation doesn't really scale.
I'm not entirely sure what payments to third parties in this case means. Can you clarify, David?
Yes.
David, you are on mute.
I'm off.
There we go.
Yeah,
there we go. You're off mute now. Could you clarify your question, please?
Yes. If you're operating a system in the 4 minutes while you're recovering, it might have been sending payments outside the scope of your bank. So if you roll back in time, things may have left your control, which no longer correspond to the state your systems are in, having been rolled back a couple, 10 minutes, half an hour, whatever it's rolled back by.
Right. So yeah, Siamak, I'll let you add some more color to my answer there in a second. So the way we're framing this is zero trust, right? One layer of protection is not enough, right? So you will have to have some intrusion prevention on your network, on your end devices, on various different things to prevent an attack in the first place, right? Which is probably something where your question is pointing to, right? Prevent it in the first place so you don't have to roll back to
really?
to prior state.
Now, where my question is coming from is that you're processing away, you're doing things, you've made payments or sent people contracts or something, which are now outside your control. They're on somebody else's system or somebody else's desk, and they have some sort of legal significance. And then you discover that a ransomware attack is in process. And as I understand the way ransomware attacks work, it starts encrypting stuff, but you may not notice that you're being attacked for some time after the attack starts. So then you go back in time to where you've got a clean system, one that you trust. But if you go back in time, some of the work you've been doing may have placed documents, contracts, or payments on somebody else's desktop,
Olivier,
where you have no control over it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, right. And yeah, go ahead, Siamak.
So I think it absolutely it is the nature of all recovery, David. Imagine if your system had crashed and you're trying to recover your system from a backup, right?
Yeah.
Any sort of recovery would be, by definition, rolling back at some point in time.
Well, no, I used to work on systems whereby if the system crashed and we recovered it from a backup, then you rolled log tapes forward, so we lost no data, and we recovered back to the point in time where it failed.
Yeah. So any sort of roll forward. Yeah. Go ahead. So yeah, any sort of roll forward. So imagine if you have kind of an Oracle and you're actually kind of logging your transactions, right? You can go back in time and then play back the transactions, roll forward your transactions. So the standard mechanisms that apply to recover from disaster applies here. We sort of try and get you back into a known good state in time. And if there are critical transactions that need to be recovered, that's outside of the scope of the infrastructure recovery. It's in the application recovery stage.
Okay, that's what I was getting at, really. But just the scope of what you're doing. So
absolutely
get back to a known point in time, but that's not the end of the process. You may have to do something to remediate the work that's gone on in the period you've rolled back over.
Absolutely. So what we're trying to do is, by having kind of early detection in the cloud, try and raise the alarm saying impacted, have a look. Okay, so you can kind of have the earliest indication possible that you may have been impacted, and then be able to go back to a known good point in time with as little data loss as possible, right? So that's kind of the goals of the system, to get you back into a healthy state. And often, the biggest barrier is really getting back into a healthy state. And there are lots of instances where it takes 20 to 30 days to get back. And part of the issue is, if you're trying to kind of recover your environment, there's a lot of in order recovery that has to take place, right? So you have to kind of recover your OS first, but to recover your OS, you have to set up, you have to recover the thing that installs your OS, the Pixie boot server, right? So now you got to go get your Pixie boot going, and you got to get your Pixie boot going. You got to get your DNS server going. So we kind of are short-circuiting all that and get you back into a known state, much more rapidly. That kind of this ordered, process of getting back online requires, which often takes a significant number of days.
That makes sense.
Yep. I hope you find the progress we've made. So the way we think about it's the foundation of the infrastructure is really the storage piece, because I was saying that the machine runs what the machine reads. So we load the machine with the image and the machine runs it. So that kind of was our plan all along, to kind of start with the storage piece of the infrastructure, and then move up to managing the infrastructure by being able to control what it actually runs. So I think we've made significant progress toward being not just a storage play, which is when we talked about cloud-defined storage, that's where we started. But now it's about really kind of managing the infrastructure in the data center as a cloud vendor would do. So that's been our plan, and we've made significant progress toward that. Would love to hear kind of feedback, questions, if there are any.
Okay, so guys, any questions for the Nebulon team? I know Andreas asked Chris, Bertrand, and Andy Bass also. I don't want to call anyone out who may actually be away from their desk. So that's why I don't want to do that. But Randy, I always pick on you, Randy. I'm so sorry. But do you have any questions, Randy? I don't know when the last time you got briefed by the Nebulon team was. What are your thoughts?
Well, we do get the opportunity to talk to Craig and Siamak regularly, so that's good. The big question has to do with, the shift in focus that Siamak's brought in, rather away from the storage he talked about, and really capturing the zeitgeist of recovery from ransomware right now. But the bigger issue is the integration with the other tools that are focused on ransomware, trying to identify when an attack occurred, occurred. That's part of it. And the second part is, I think somebody else brought this up, but many customers want to go into a sandbox area to test the recovery before actually going live. And is that possible with your solution?
So the way you think, so yeah, that's a great question. So the sandbox often is because they're trying to kind of bring their environment up in an isolated environment to ensure that it's actually coming up and it's doing as intended, and it's not really still infected. We don't believe that's something that you can avoid. What we allow you to do is to be able to test different recovery points very rapidly. So if you think about the process of trying to go back to a known good state, it's a time-consuming process. That's one of the most time-consuming parts of recovery is to kind of go to a known state point in time and figure out, is this good? No, let's go back further in time. So we are helping the customer by trying to detect when potentially they were impacted, so at least they have a window that they can go back to and say, okay, yeah, that's the part. The other piece, Randy, is by where does so a typical kind of anatomy of an attack is they get on your system and they lie in wait. They're kind of trying to infect as many systems as possible, and when they're ready to go, then they start to actually encrypt the systems. Well, where do they actually kind of lie in wait? They actually kind of install themselves or embed themselves in the OS and just sit there for the right opportunity. By having the server itself immutable, so every time you boot the server, it goes back into a known point in time, and in fact, it's all protected from the OS. It's all the hardware underneath that is doing it in a protected domain in a security enclave on the card itself. Essentially, every time you reboot the server, it puts it back, and it should get rid of the lie in wait, ransomware that is sitting in your environment that it hasn't had a chance to act yet. So when it does act, we actually are trying to tell you as to close to a window of when it occurred, so it can go back to a known point in time. But when it does happen, you still have to go through kind of the due diligence process of bringing it up, ensuring that it's actually a clean system, and if it's not, then go back to a previous point in time.
Okay, and what about integrating with other elements like QRadar and SecureX, et cetera?
That's a great question, and we are kind of we are early in the process of kind of bringing this technology in, and so as a part of kind of completing the ecosystem support, we have to go work with those other vendors.
Okay, thanks.
I follow up on that, please. This is Chris
Sure.
from Blocks and Files.
Sure.
I'm thinking that if you're buying service from Dell or HP or Lenovo and Nebulon, then you're probably facing two control planes. One is the Nebulon managed control plane from the cloud, and the other is the server manufacturer's own control plane. So one question is, are you looking to integrate with the manufacturer's own control planes? And secondly, when those control planes are themselves in the cloud and heading towards an AI ops future, is the integration going to go that way as well? And I'm thinking specifically of Dell, HP, and Lenovo here, and possibly Cisco.
Right. So we are absolutely talking to the OEMs about integrating with their control planes, and so that's kind of a step that we have to go through. But the part that is kind of interesting about those vendors, they often are much more into kind of managing the physical hardware layer, as opposed to kind of the next step, which is so they are in the business of managing the hardware and also installing the applications, initial kind of application that has the right driver for that vendor. Okay, so those are the two steps that they typically integrate. The difficulty with often those customers is that their controls are often on premises and they're not in the cloud. Okay, so if you think about Lenovo, HP, and Dell, they all have means of managing their infrastructure. Now, some of them are trying to kind of migrate some of those services to the cloud, but they're primarily inside the data center. And so the advantage of doing it all from the cloud is if you're impacted, the entire infrastructure is impacted, including your management. And this is kind of the point that is difficult to sort of think through is you're trying to get your environment up, but the thing that is managing your environment itself has been impacted and is down. So you have a chicken and egg problem. How do you actually kind of bring up the systems where the systems that are needed to bring them up themselves are impacted? By having the management itself in the cloud, you're insulated from that ransomware attack, and you have a clean management environment to try and recover your systems from. Okay. Now, having said that, there are points of integration, at least for support, for instance, that we have with the OEM. So when we detect something, for instance, at drive, we can actually notify the OEM vendor that a particular piece of hardware needs to be, for instance, replaced in the data center.
HPE seems to me to be moving to a cloud-based management plane with things like the cloud console.
They are, yeah, they are. Yeah, they're actually kind of, they're moving some of their stuff into the cloud, but the proportion of customers connected to the cloud is quite low, number one. Number two, the difficulty is if the customer has HP and Dell, and there are very few customers that are single vendored, right? People for a number of reasons tend to have multi-vendor, and because each one has its own unique ways of doing things, and they're not really multi-vendor. HP has no interest in managing Dell hardware, for instance, right? So the customers are loath to adopt because they're often not single vendored.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Siamak, when you say that it's a very low percentage of customers connected to the cloud, are you referring to the HPE cloud off Greenlight? What are you referring to with that statement?
Well,
not that I'm disagreeing with it, I'm just what are you referring to?
Sure. So if you think about kind of the server LOM on HPE servers, right? They have a cloud capability. They can connect to the cloud and report to the cloud, but they often are not connected to the cloud. It's and it's got a bit of a mindset, right? Storage servers nearly always are connected to the cloud. That's just how you get the best service, right? They're reporting telemetry, and people are just kind of have the mindset of, yeah, if I have storage, it's connected to the cloud, so I can kind of get the best service from the vendor. Servers are just not that way. Servers are atypical. Their LOMs are it's just not typical for the LOMs to be connected to the cloud, because the set of services that they get is essentially kind of hardware services, and it's unique to that vendor, and so they just typically don't connect to the cloud.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Kimberly?
Kimberly?
Oh, I nodded my head. Yes, sorry.
Okay.
No,
we have a question from Simon again. Where do you get signals from to detect attacks? Are there integration points with SIEMs?
Okay, so for us, this is kind of interesting. We have a very different approach to detection. So you could think of detection happening at the network layer, and there are fantastic tools out there for doing that. Our detection is fundamentally different. We are actually monitoring the IO that is occurring to the storage. So any sort of ransomware, both the encryption process itself, it changes the property of the data and the entropy of the data that is being written to the drives. So we have tools that monitors the entropy of the data and reports that continuously to the cloud. And so by being able to kind of detect changes in the nature of the data that is coming into the backend media, we can sort of use that as means of saying something strange is happening in terms of so on the network, for instance, they monitor connection to unusual endpoints, right? That's kind of how they sometimes detect what's going on. They have antivirus watch for unusual binaries. For us, the detection level is at the level of the storage. If the data that is being written to the backend media changes its characteristic behavior, compression, level, entropy of the data, the nature of the IO, is it read versus write? So there's a number of signals that we look for, and that's kind of how we try and detect whether the customer is being attacked actively or not. So it's a very different way to look at the actual characteristic behavior of the system. From network, it's purely focused on the storage piece.
Simon, did that answer your question? Yeah, that was a thumbs up. I wanted to ask Anthony there without the hat now. I just wanted to see if you had any questions, because and you're on mute. You're on mute, by the way, Anthony.
I don't really, actually, Fred. Sorry.
Oh, good. Excellent. Brilliant. Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, I have one probably fairly spurious one about the Nebulon life cycle. One of the things that occurs to me is, as a question, do you have a feel or percentage number of your customers who are using your services, your products for just evaluating how they move to the cloud because they're too scared to do it. They're too big, too scared to do whatever. But so they want to stay with where they are at the moment, but find out about the cloud. Because at some point, doesn't it get more convenient or economic to move to the cloud once they've worked out how to do it and how to run it using Nebulon?
So that's a fantastic question, Martin. I think, in fact, the conversation is exactly the opposite in some ways. So let's talk about why people move to cloud. They typically, nobody really moves to the cloud to save cost. Cloud costs are typically more expensive than actually if you deployed it. Now, if you're a small or medium-sized company where you don't have a sophisticated IT staff, it may be reasonable for you to go to the cloud. But if you're kind of a medium to larger enterprise, economically, it just makes sense to actually run your own infrastructure. So why do people go to the cloud? It really is around velocity and elasticity. By velocity, I mean how quickly can I get my stuff going? And if I have an unpredictable type of workload and it needs to be elastic and sort of go large really fast, then that's when cloud makes a lot of sense. So on the velocity piece, what we are noticing with a lot of customers, right? The internal developers are going to the enterprise IT customers and say, well, I want a database. I want something like this. And the IT guy says, well, it's going to take me 6 weeks to get you something going. So what they do, they go and run their credit card on AWS and they start developing their application on AWS. And then once the development is done and they're comfortable with what they've actually developed, and it comes to the deployment phase, by then the enterprise IT has gotten its act together and they've got their database going and they actually deploy inside the data center. So this velocity actually helps the internal application develop to get going and develop the application as quickly as possible, right? And then, but what happens is that they've kind of developed with this kind of cloud platform model in mind. And then when you're trying to deploy it inside the data center, if you're doing it in a legacy, it's just much harder to deploy inside the data center then, right? So that, if you're developing using the cloud model, using Ansible and kind of, APIs, and you say, okay, well, I want to take that application and the standard for organization is that the applications get deployed inside for security reasons or compliance reasons, then you bring it back and actually deploy it on Nebulon. Okay.
Yeah, so just going on from that, but what about businesses which require a fair amount of agility and headroom? They presumably, that means they're back in the old catch of having to buy resources that are predominantly not used but only needed once a month or whenever.
Yeah, so I think that's so again, if the nature of your workload is highly elastic, then in fact cloud may be a reasonably effective or cost-effective means of running your application. If your application is amenable to going to the cloud, so for instance, there are no compliance or security reasons why you can't take it to the cloud. So if elasticity is a big part of what you do, it does make sense. But the significant applications just don't have that elastic behavior, right? They're a database, there's a certain number of transactions they get because it's some sort of order entry process, and they just don't have that kind of requirement, right? So even so this is something you see all the time. And some large organizations, for instance, like JP Morgan, they have like 20,000 application developers. They have a data set and on their customers, for instance, and they're continuously rolling out new services or new applications. And those services and new applications that they're developing, they just aren't as elastic as something like the cloud, where all of a sudden, a million people with their phones are going to show up and go to your app and do something funny. It's just they have a known number of customers, they have a known set of pattern of access, and so they are just for them velocity matters much more than elasticity, and the velocity of development can be addressed by just developing in the cloud, but then deploying inside the data center for security reasons.
Yeah. Fine, thanks.
Absolutely.